So I shot that video yesterday, and there are a couple of facts I forgot to include. The first one is that a couple of those other national franchises that were included in the original lawsuit have now joined the settlement agreement, increasing the total settlement amount to $680 million. Now, you got to ask yourself, how much are the plaintiffs going to get of that? When you do the math, it works out to about $900 per plaintiff, which, taken in the context of a real estate transaction, is not a lot of money. The attorneys for the plaintiffs, however, right now they're going to get about $226 million. So when you look at who really won that lawsuit, was it the public? I would argue no. Was it the plaintiffs? Yes, but with an asterisk. It was really the attorneys that brought the lawsuit that won. So after last week's video on office exclusive listings, I had a few clients reach out to me and ask me what the Sitzer Burnett lawsuit was because I mentioned it. And I figured it would be a good idea just to explain a little bit of the history of the lawsuit and where it came from and how it's impacted our market in the DMV. So to understand the lawsuit, first you have to understand the history of the MLS. So the first MLS was created in 1908. That's the first time a group of real estate agents and an association got together and said, you know what, we should probably publish a list for everyone to see of all of the available properties that are on our market. And that grew through the decades. And by the mid-1960s, some of the associations started to realize the tremendous benefit that the sellers and buyers were getting from being in the MLS, but they needed to find some way of incentivizing those brokers with outside companies to bring their buyers to another brokerage's listings. And out of that came mandatory cooperative compensation, which basically said, if you're going to have your property listed in our MLS, and it's going to get disseminated to all the brokers in the area, you need to give those brokers compensation if they bring one of their buyers to your listing. Now, this worked tremendously for home sellers and tremendously for home buyers, because now the sellers got access to basically the buyers that were working with all of the other companies. And those buyers got a benefit that if they ended up buying a listing from another brokerage, the compensation for their agent was paid for out of the listing agreement with the seller. So you fast forward to 1983, the National Association of Realtors sees how much of a benefit this is, and they mandate cooperative compensation nationwide. So basically they say, if you're going to put your listing in the MLS, then you have to offer some form of compensation to another company that brings a buyer to your transaction. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that they did not say how much that compensation had to be. It could have been 1 penny, it could be $1. Nothing in there mandated the amount. It was just the fact that it had to be offered. And what came out of that was buyer agency. So up until 1993, if you were a broker with another brokerage and you brought a buyer to another company's listing and your buyer bought that listing, you didn't represent that buyer. You actually represented that seller as a sub-agent of the other listing company. So in the early 90s, everyone figured out that, you know what, that's probably wrong. If a buyer has an agent taking them around and showing them properties, that agent should probably be on their side and not the seller's side at these showings. So what ended up getting created was buyer agency, where now there was a legal mechanism for that agent to represent their buyer's best interests. So the cooperation policy was updated to where they said, now you have to offer compensation to a sub-agent or a buyer's agent, right? And buyer agency flourished. We ended up coming up with what is considered to be the most consumer-friendly real estate market in the world, where home sellers got access to every buyer, regardless of whether or not that buyer was working with their listing brokerage. And all of these buyers got access to these other companies' listings, and they didn't have to pay a penalty because that listing broker was going to share some compensation with that buyer's agent. So the buyer a lot of times ended up not coming out of pocket up front or bringing cash into the transaction to have someone look out for their side. It ended up coming out of the listing broker's commission, which was built sort of into the sale price. Now, 2019, a bunch of class action attorneys in Missouri go, you know what? The fact that you have to offer compensation is akin to price fixing, regardless of the fact that it doesn't say how much that compensation had to be. So there's a humongous lawsuit involving the National Association of Realtors and a bunch of the other big nationwide brokerages. And when the judge went to give the jury instructions for their deliberation, he said, you cannot look at any of the good that has come from this system that has evolved. You have to only look at it in the black and white lens of if compensation is mandatory to be offered to go into this MLS, you have to find for the plaintiffs. You cannot look at it in any other way. You can't take into consideration all of the good that has come with it. And he really painted the jury into a corner, and they had to find for the plaintiffs. Now, when the original verdict came out, the National Association of Realtors was very confident that they were going to win on appeal, because apparently there is this legal doctrine where the jury could have looked at all the good that has come from this and all the efficiencies that have come from this, but he told them they could not look at this. And the NAR felt like they had a very strong case for appeal, but the problem was that in order to appeal, they would have to have put up $1.4 billion just for the right to appeal, which, clearly they did not have. So they had to negotiate some form of settlement. And what ended up coming out of the negotiated settlement was NAR paying $418 million to the plaintiffs, and then making two changes. One, they had already made a couple years earlier. They could not mandate cooperative compensation anymore, which they had actually done a couple of years earlier. That was taken out. But the other one, they could not advertise how much any cooperative compensation was in the MLS. So basically, if you have a listing and you sign a listing agreement and you offer cooperative compensation as an incentive to the buyers working with other companies, you just can't advertise that anymore. You can't advertise it in the MLS, at least. So what's changed practically in our market, because at the time, 17 states already had buyer agency laws where the buyer had to sign an agreement and agree how much commission they were going to pay their buyer's agent. And, most of the times that commission ended up getting offset by the stipend or the cooperative compensation that came from the listing agreement. Maryland was already one of them. Virginia was already one of them. Delaware was already one of them. DC, by default, sort of already acted like this, because DC, through GCAR, the Greater Capillary Association of Realtors, which is the same association that covers Montgomery County, had buyer agencies. So by default, they were already sort of complying. So in our area, nothing has really changed other than the fact that as an agent, I now have to call the listing broker and find out how much the cooperative compensation is. What we're finding is the vast majority of sellers still see a value in offering cooperative compensation to a buyer's agent. I mean, honestly, 95% of buyers are represented by a buyer agent because they want a professional on their side to help shepherd them through usually the biggest financial transaction that they're going to make in their life, and they want someone on their side looking out for their interests. So I say that it really hasn't changed a lot in the way we do business locally. Most listings still have cooperative compensation. The only change has really been that you just can't advertise it in the MLS. So that's a brief history of the MLS and the Sitzer Burnett settlement. If you have any questions, reach out. I'd be more than happy to help.